Welcome to Noisecutter.
Thanks for joining on this episode of the Noisecutter podcast. I'm here with conflict journalist Danny Gold. Danny, what's up?
Hey, how's it going, man? Thanks for having me.
No, for sure. I've been on Twitter and I scroll and perhaps doom scroll, right? And one of the great takes that I see are Danny's tweets, right? And so one, if you don't follow Danny on Twitter, go do that now, fix that mistake. But your takes have been really enlightening. And that was a big part of the reason why I was like, hey, should definitely have Danny on for one of the first episodes of Noisecutter. The other thing is Danny produces an incredible podcast with his colleague Sean Williams called The Underworld Podcast. It did the funny job of educating me on Indian music, specifically the episode on Sidhu Moosewala, which I thought was one of the best podcast episodes I've listened to ever. Very full-size story.
Thank you, man.
But with that all, Danny, why don't you give us a quick, who you are and what you've been working on and how we got here.
Yeah. I am I was mostly a journalist for about a decade, and I covered mostly war and conflict. I worked for everyone from Vice News. I was one of the people who helped start it to, I've written for magazines like Wired, Sports Illustrated, Esquire, Rolling Stone. I've also done TV stuff for PBS NewsHour. And that was mostly what my career was until the pandemic. In recent years, I've mostly been doing podcasting, like the Underworld podcast, and producing a couple other things focused on organized crime. But yeah, these sort of stories pop off. I don't consider myself really a journalist anymore. I don't even want to be a commentator or pundit. I'm just someone who is hopelessly addicted to the toxicity of Twitter and finds myself on there way too much, saying things when I probably shouldn't. It's basically where I am right now.
Well, so one of the things about that comment probably shouldn't, right, is it's kind of funny, and we've had offline conversations about this. It's these are things that maybe we wouldn't want to have to say but feel compelled to. Why? Because there's so many people saying the wrong things, and I'll just go out and say it. It's nonsense, right? There's a lot of nonsense, and I feel like if the right people with sort of measured and educated views don't say anything, what happens? We've seen this in 2016, right? The nonsense prevails.
Yeah, I think there's a temptation there for journalists, politicians, whoever else, that you want to match the atmosphere of what's happening around you. And what's happening around you is toxic, it's impulsive, it's vitriolic. And, I had to keep relatively quiet when I was a journalist. Now I'm a bit louder. So there's stuff on there that I just feel the need to occasionally call out and point out the hypocrisy of. And it's a dangerous thing to do. I consider myself I want everyone to be aware of my biases. I'm Jewish. I grew up in America. I have a decent amount of family in Israel. I have friends in Gaza. I've reported in Gaza during the 2014 war, and I had no problem showing what I consider to be, war crimes, things of that nature. But I still believe in a two-state solution. I think that's the only way, and that's kind of where I'm coming from. Israel has sheltered a lot of my family. It doesn't mean I support the occupation. I think the occupation is horrendous and a war crime that should have ended yesterday. But I just want people to be aware of where I stand before they hear what I have to say, because I want them to take everything with a grain of salt. No one ever, just TikTok, Twitter, all this, Instagram are full of people who have no actual investment in it, and in this situation, and don't read books on any of this stuff. Don't study it, haven't been there, and are just going with their worst impulses. And I think I'm talking about people on every side. And I think that doesn't benefit anyone in the long run. We don't know. So social media has only really been around for, in this way, I don't know, 5-10 years. We don't know the effect that it's actually having. No one knows the effect that it's actually having on this stuff. And I know it's restricted to online, right? But that has implications in the real world. Not always. I mean, if you were online in 2016, you would have thought that Bernie Sanders would be president, right? So it doesn't always have real world implications, but I think it does. And I think it gets people riled up to a way. Sometimes it's good, right? I think it's good that more people are speaking out against the occupation, but I think it also demonizes people. And again, this goes for both sides in a way that feeds this bloodthirsty narrative and doesn't lend itself to any sort of resolution in the future.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, one thing about the Bernie Sanders thing, right, or the lead up to the election, right? It's like there's the internet has become kind of like nodularized, I guess maybe is the word, or it exists in pockets, right? So in maybe our pocket of the internet, that was true, right? But then on certain other pockets of the internet that we, for probably good reasons, like don't typically inhabit, the reverse would have been true, right? But like, I think you're right, is that perhaps in the digital age, right, like we see a segmentation of information and therefore a segmentation of thought, and then the discourse becomes people shouting at each other and not actually having a conversation.
Right. And I think even in the segmentation I'm seeing now, and I think I mostly follow reasonable people on all sides, it's just there's a level of toxicity that, few and far between for an issue like this. And I can tell you I've reported on it, and that stands true, and you report on it as well. And there's just a lot of fake stuff out there that you would think people who, even journalists who do this for a living, are getting caught up in, because they have their biases as well. And it's disturbing. Like it keeps me up at night. It's definitely very, very concerning.
The thing you said about having reported from Gaza in 2014, that's something I actually didn't know, and it leads me to a question: is you were there on the ground at that time, and you're seeing it now. What's changed and what's different, and what's notable about the sort of differences there?
Yeah, I mean, I think this attack in Israel is so 2014. It started off with the kidnapping of these three Jewish men
Right.
in Jerusalem. They were burned alive.
Right.
They were killed. It was a horrific attack. There were counterattacks by hardline Israelis, and then it led to this conflict that the Palestinian factions launched rockets. I thought it was unnecessary. The conflict itself. I mean, Israel's response was unnecessary.
Right.
This time, when you look at what happened and you actually read about what was just the sheer numbers alone and what was done to these people, I don't know. I don't know what to do. I don't think there's any, look, I'm not happy about what's happening in Gaza. I don't think there's any country in the world that would not do anything in return when 1,200 civilians were killed and tortured and, all the stuff that, I don't know, man. It's disturbing in a way that look, I don't have high expectations for people. I've been around the world. I've been in the center of multiple ethnic conflicts, but the response that the murder of Israeli civilians got. Look, if Hamas, PIJ, whoever sneaks up on Israeli soldiers, even if it kills them in their bed, that's war. I'm not going to say I'm in favor of that. I'm not a psychopath, but like that's war. And that's the tactics that they're left with. And I think that it's not okay, but it is what it is. Like that's war. They're fighting a war. Israel's fighting a war against them. But to kill over 1,000 civilians, the level of support that got in terms of people being like, yeah, they deserved it. People in the West, people I know, like I've never, I don't have high hopes for people, but I've never seen anything like that. Like even in a conflict like Syria, you would have a hard time finding anyone, even the opposing side, that would support the murdering of 1,200 civilians. And I'm looking at my Instagram. I woke up that Saturday morning. I have a million messages, WhatsApp, family, friends, concern, all this sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to figure out what's on. I open up my Instagram and it's like this rich person that I know talking about like, this is what resistance is. And we only find out a day later that the only reason my cousin's kibbutz, she's in her 80s, wasn't slaughtered was because there's video out there. They couldn't get the gate open because they're what's known as Shomer Shabbos. They don't use electricity. That's the only reason that she survived. So, once I see something like that, it changed something, I think, in my head, of just like, look, I've known people have hated Israel. Look, if you're one of these people who thinks that Israel shouldn't exist, I don't agree with you, but you're entitled to your opinion. But when you start being okay with the like wanton slaughter of civilians, that is just that caught me by surprise. And then the level of support that it continued to get and the justification for it. And then even now, what we're seeing is like the atrocity denial, right? Where there's pictures of the blood and people are like, that's not what blood looks like. And then someone will be like, I work in a morgue. That's exactly what blood looks. It doesn't matter. That is so widespread right now. And the whole like decolonization thing. It's insane to me that this is what people are. The same people who were all about words are violence and all that sort of stuff are now like, no, actually, actual violence is okay because we disagree with these people, even though they're women and children. So I'm sorry I've gone off on a rant, but it's just like,
No,
I don't understand how these people. That's the thing, this person who posted that, she's never seen what a bullet does to a body, right? They've never
right,
smelled the blood.
right.
To them, it's all a fucking game. It's all anyway. I'm gonna
Yeah.
stop myself, and
No, no, no.
let's keep going.
I have a difficult question for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's about this person and people like her,
Yeah.
right? Do you think they're aware internally of the views they're perpetuating, or are they lying to themselves?
Yeah, I think. Look, I don't know how to rationalize or what's in their hearts or in their minds. Look, I think people who are pro Palestine, who are anti Israel, are like. I think a lot of that movement is legitimate, and they care
Sure.
for
Yeah.
Palestinians and they want equality. I
Yeah.
think there's also like a not small amount of people who get in there because they hate Jews, they have other issues, and it's always been the kind of cause where you can mask yourself in it and get forgiven. You have these internet personalities now who were very supportive of what Russia was doing in Ukraine, very
Right.
supportive of what Assad was doing in Syria,
Right.
which included a lot of starvation sieges in Yarmouk of Palestinian communities, of a lot of deaths. And they're able to wrap themselves in the cloak of supporting Palestine. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like I said, I think there's a legitimate. I think it's a legitimate cause.
Sure. Yeah.
Some of the stuff though, like raises red flags for me. I don't even think, some people get offended. I think hardline Israeli supporters get offended by free Palestine. I have no problem with that. I think that's legit. I used to not have a problem with from the river to the sea because I think it meant freedom for everyone from the river to the sea. Some people that would say that turned around a week and a half ago and were like, no, we actually mean like killing Israelis and getting them out of here. That's what it means. So I don't
Yeah.
know. I'm not the best analyst. Like I said, I have my biases, but it's been a disturbing couple of weeks.
Yeah. I mean, it's been, disturbing for sure, revelatory as well, right? Like, there's a lot of, and so this is the next thing I kind of want to get into with you, which is the discourse in many American liberal circles, including the Black Lives Matter movement, but then also like how that discourse kind of can be a bit, can get a bit perverse, right? Because there's folks that I would never have thought who would support like the and be, applauding, right, the mass murder of civilians. And yeah, talk to me about what you've seen from that side of things, and sort of if you've been surprised, right, by the
Yeah,
reactions of some folks.
I definitely have. I mean, I don't want to make it about that in general, right? Because it's about a
Sure.
lot more. It's about Palestinian lives. It's about Israeli lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
But to gloss over that, and some people were trying to be like, "Oh, why are you talking about this when what's happening in the Middle East is happening?" And it's like there are people marching on American campuses and professors that are
Yeah.
cheering the slaughter of people who I know that are mourning right now. To say that just
Yeah.
because it's college campuses and professors and whatever, it's not why. Like, don't tell me not to be concerned about that. That's insane.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
no one would do that for any other group in this world. So yeah, I'm putting it lightly, but yes, it bothers me. Um,
Yeah.
Part of me isn't super surprised by it. Part of me is because I never thought it would get that far, but it is revelatory for sure. You know,
Yeah.
there's the Black Lives Matter thing. I have I think it was like local chapters. I don't think it was a uniform thing, so I don't want to
Sure.
attach
Sure. Sure.
a
Sure.
stigma to the entire Black Lives Matter movement. But when
Sure.
you stand for human rights and all that, and which is a lot of not just these Black Lives Matters chapter, but other people who claim that, right? Again, and these are the same people who say words are violence, and
Mhm.
you're putting a power glider up as like your support, right? That's not supporting Palestinian freedom, right? That's
Right.
supporting the murder of Israelis and Jews too, because they murdered a lot of people from all over the world in that. I mean, that was a slaughter.
Right.
They
Right.
slaughtered people at a party. So yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of people, it definitely showed something, and it's not a thing that I think a lot of Jews and Israelis are going to forget.
Yeah. Um, One thing I was going to say is the incredibly troubling and kind of like hits home thing about that. The professor, right, being elated by the violence that's my alma mater, right? So I went to Cornell, and the education system, I think, definitely right espouses the sort of moral relativism discourse, right? That like it's not fair to place our own value judgments on others. What are they to do so on ours? Context obviously matters a lot, but then there's always the dangers at the extremes, right? And like you would think that the people charged with the education and development of like impressionable minds would know better, right? And so like, yeah, I don't know, that stuff kind of like really bothers me because it's like that's an institution that I might one day want to send my own kids to, right? And like, really, like,
Yeah.
I don't know. Cornell, I think, did a better job. They quickly denounced, that statement in those videos and whatnot. Some of the other institutions, I think, took a bit more time and had a bit more of a complex relationship with
Yeah.
their positions on that.
Look, I'm not someone who thinks every university has to offer up a statement on this kind of stuff, right? But it's
Sure.
like,
Yeah.
that's what they were doing. All like everything was about statements of oppression, all this sort of stuff, and then for them to ignore this and then support people who justify it,
Yeah.
it's off-putting. But like I said, I don't want to focus too much on the college campus activist issue sort of thing
Yeah.
because
True. Yeah.
but yeah, I mean it's eye-opening. I think in a lot of the intersectionality, progressive left movement sort of situation, um, Jews were never seen as people they needed to really defend unless it was coming from like the far right wing. Uh, and that's for a number of reasons because Jews are seen as successful, because they're seen as rich, because in America, they like even though there's a lot of poor Jews that people completely gloss over, they're not
Right.
seen as being oppressed, and they're not oppressed in the same way that a lot of minorities are. But to pretend that like
Sure.
there isn't this global history of that, or that like it isn't, walk around as a visible Jew in some cities
Right.
in this, and then tell me that like there's no issues.
Right.
Look, it's not like I'm saying there's state supported violence like blacks or Latinos face. It's not the same,
Right.
but
Right.
it's definitely not all great. I'll just put it that
Yeah.
way.
Yeah. Let's pivot to, I guess, the experience of journalists, right? And so, like, one of the things that's been kind of like making the rounds on, on TikTok, Instagram Reels, YouTube, and just the video platforms in general is this video, recently of a Palestinian activist called Rama Zain, who was at the Rafah border crossing, and she has a back and forth with Clarissa Ward, right? And I want to get to sort of like your thoughts on that in a second. Just to kind of go into it. So she starts shouting right at Clarissa Ward and blaming CNN, obviously her outlet, and the other Western outlets for not showing a balanced or even-handed scope, I would say, of coverage over the issues right in Israel and in Gaza, et cetera. And then the thing that was shocking to me, right, and I follow Clarissa on Instagram. I was looking at her videos, and she was like, look, I have to shut this down for a minute and shut down my comments because I'm getting death threats, and I can only read so many death threats about my children. And I found that to be like highly disturbing, but also it's like, look, we live in a media savvy world, right? Where like journalism matters perhaps now more than ever, and it's accessible now more than ever to more people than ever. And it's important, right, for us to have, like you were saying at the top here, right? Informed, educated, balanced views as much as possible on the issues that are prevailing. Journalists are sort of the core of how we get that, right? Because we can't all be in Gaza, we can't all be in Israel, etc. But as a journalist who's covered this stuff and having been in Gaza yourself and covering lots of like difficult topics, right? You're a conflict journalist. What is that experience like?
Yeah, well, I'll say Clarissa is one of the best journalists in the world, and she's never been the kind of person who has blindly repeated American or American allies or Israeli statements. She's taking a lot of risks, and she's great at what she does, and it's really unfair to put this on her. But this is one of those conflicts, and there's a few others where the level of toxicity that you get from both sides is unparalleled. It is nothing like I've experienced before. No matter what you do, no matter how impartial you are, you're going to get it from every side. And there's very little you can do in your actual reporting to make up for that. But it's like, I don't know. I would say 20 years ago there would be that sort of case about the mainstream media and neglecting Palestinian stories. I don't think that's the case now. I look at the New York Times where, and this is a perfect encapsulation of this issue, where
Mm-hmm.
people I know who are right wing pro Israel types think it's a extremely anti-Semitic newspaper. People I know who are very
Yeah.
pro Palestine think it's a very anti-Palestinian newspaper, and that's
Mm-hmm.
just the case with this. I mean, if you look at screw ups with this story, I don't think there's a bigger one than the hospital situation. I think the beheaded babies thing was something that didn't get too much print, I think, in big media or whatever. Like if you watch the actual thing of how it shifted, it was a lot of online activists that ran with it. When the woman herself wasn't even saying that, the reporter who said it, I think that was definitely a fuck up for sure. But then, of course,
Mm-hmm.
we've seen reports come out in the last couple of days from the people who did the autopsies, from the rescuers that were like, yeah, they not 40, but yes, babies were beheaded, but people were burned alive. Like horrific shit
Mm-hmm.
happened. The hospital thing, I was shocked at how bad that journalism was, and the fact that it
Yeah,
got
I
major
covered
play and
that.
all.
Yeah.
It's insane to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because there's no putting that back in the toothpaste, right? You can't put that back.
Right.
And
Right.
look, the IDF lies, right? We know that they've lied about things before,
Sure.
but Hamas lies about everything too. Like I've
Yeah.
been in Gaza. You cannot report the truth and stay in Gaza if that's what you're looking to do. It's not possible. You will get your
Yeah.
fixer, the local Gazans you're working with, you will get them in serious trouble. There's in
Yeah.
2014 when I was there was an Indian TV crew, NDTV, that was able to
Mm-hmm.
film Hamas launching rockets. They were
Mm-hmm.
only able to publish that when they left, because they know if they did, which isn't even anything egregious, right? It's just showing them like how their rocket crews work. They would have
Yeah.
been kicked out, and their local fixer, which the local journalist that usually helps you, would have been in a lot of trouble. So
Mm-hmm.
what I'm trying to say is both sides in this lie a lot. But to run with, it was pretty obvious from seeing it, even when it was happening, that it wasn't 500. I mean, we can. The point is that it was like a complete dereliction of duty, and
Yeah.
I'm pretty ashamed of the industry itself for what happens.
Yeah. And that was one that was, I mean, if we want to talk about the hospital blast, I mean, so I write a Substack, and I wrote an issue. It was simply an exercise of logic and ethics, right? So there are two statements. There was a blast at a hospital in Gaza, statement number one. Palestinian officials, Hamas, has accused the IDF of bombing the hospital, of causing the blast, right? So these statements are both true. There was a blast at the hospital, and the officials did accuse the IDF. True and true. However, one is true top to bottom, right? The blast that occurred, the factum of it is, yes, there's a blast, there's a crater, there's bodies, there's damage, etc. The second is a truth about an accusation, but in like a courtroom setting, we would call this kind of like hearsay, right? Like you can offer it for the fact that the statement was made, right? Sure, but you can't offer it for the truth of it, right? For the truth of the matter asserted, which is to say that just because they said it doesn't make it true. However, right? So like you can still report on both things, but I think the headline, the crux of the story, is the former, right? That a blast occurred and there was a tragedy, and some of the stuff that Ramazan was saying to Clarissa Ward is like, look, Palestinian babies were also killed, right? Where are the photographs of them? Where are the? And again, I think there's that's a bit of unfairness, right? Because it's much harder to get that information. It's much harder to access.
Well, but
both in
also,
Gaza.
I don't mean to cut you off,
Yeah,
but
no, go for it. Go for it.
there's a lot of people online right now who are saying
Yeah.
that Israeli babies weren't killed. Right, they're in
Yeah,
complete
yeah,
denial.
yeah.
The pictures
Yeah.
are out there, right? The photos are out there, and you can see the response that people post on Instagram or on Twitter. They're first, it was, this is good. Then it was, okay, it was justified. And now it's that it didn't happen. It's insane. A couple of those pictures of blood going around, people are like, that's not what blood looks like. You don't know what blood looks like. Get the fuck out of here.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean that sort of stuff is also kind of nuts, right? And so that sort of circles back to what I was saying earlier about, like, do you think these people are actually? Do they think they've become like pathologists all of a sudden, or like do you think they actually think that they know what blood looks like and they're just deluding themselves, or do you think they're actually disingenuous and saying, of course I don't know what blood looks like, but I'm just going to say this shit because it's what I want to say?
I think it's what they want to say, but I also think they've just, the online culture of the last like 5, 6, 7 years
Yeah.
has made it so like anything even remotely having to do with Israel and to a lesser degree Jews is like lies, right? It's not
Yeah.
true. It's made
Yeah.
up. It's manipulation. Um, it's a constant thing in the Middle East that Israel is like
Yeah.
this all-seeing, all-knowing, all-manipulating entity. When it's a
Yeah.
lot more incompetent than, and as we can clearly see, than people want to give it credit for. But it's like, everything is their fault, everything they've done. And that's kind of like what we're seeing here, right? Where it's like, um, the babies aren't actually dead. There was no thing. The Israelis themselves killed all those people. Like it's insane. I think some of these people do actually believe it. I think a lot of them are just in these like sort of in circles online where that's what you have to say. But
Yeah.
I mean, this is like English language, like American Twitter, right? Imagine how bad
Yeah.
it is in the rest of the world.
Yeah, no, I mean, so I hear what you're saying about the perception of the like omnipotence and the omniscience of Mossad, right? I mean, I think they've done a lot, and perhaps this is to by their own design, right, to
Right.
create this image of
Create a
themselves,
legend.
right? As
Yeah.
yeah, but so there's a book. I don't know if you've read it or if you've met this person because he's a very prominent Israeli journalist. Maybe you have. Is a book by Ronan Bergman called "Rise and Kill First."
Yeah,
Or
I've read it.
Rise and Kill First. Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think that look, one can always speculate as to whether or not things are truly a balanced take or not. But I think he does provide, at least in my whatever opinion, a fairly balanced take, both the successes and also the like incompetent failures of the
Yeah.
Mossad, right? And it really paints a picture of like this is an organization like any other that's just trying to do what it's chartered to do for its citizens, and sometimes they do it really well, and sometimes they don't. But it certainly counters the narrative that like, yeah, look, the Mossad is in our podcast room right now, and they're watching us do this, right? Like,
Right.
So one of the things, and I guess like social media being the force, I don't want to say dominant force, but like certainly a large force in media today, it platforms people that maybe shouldn't have platforms, and it really gives succor, I would say, to charlatans, right? And so one of the things that's been kind of making the rounds on Twitter, etc., is a claim by a figure by the name of Sean King that he had something to do with the negotiation and the release of the 2 American hostages that occurred recently by Hamas. And I saw Danny's tweets on this stuff, and I was like, this is something I want to talk about. I knew we were going to have this conversation. And I guess, yeah, and take it away. What's going on?
Yeah. So Sean King was an activist, or is an activist, who got his start really in Black Lives Matter. And, he got a lot of attention. I think did some initial good work, but then it started being revealed as the years passed that he was, he did a lot of fundraising and all this. And there were a lot of accusations that he was stealing money, never donating the fundraising that he got. And it's not, this was a thing where you had a lot of Black activists sort of accusing him of this stuff, right? It wasn't a thing where you had like Fox News saying it, right?
Right.
Just fraud after fraud, saying he's going to do something, raising money, then not doing it. And I guess he's still very popular on Instagram, and he's glommed onto Israel, Palestine as like his next thing. And he's been he's one of those people that posts in a way that it's intended to rile people up in a non-beneficial way. I think he's like sowing the seeds of tons of hate, running with stuff that's obviously fake, but just nonstop. And then he had posted that he was friends with the family that was abducted and released, that he was in contact with them, and that he was working behind the scenes to help free them and with a ceasefire, which is like an obviously nonsense thing.
Yeah.
And this is, like I said, there's a lot of good people in the Free Palestine movement, but it gets glommed onto by bad actors who see it as cover for the stuff that they've done before. And it got into Israel, and it caused like this controversy. There were conspiracy theories, and then the family themselves, the family of the abducted, had to clarify and be like, we don't know who this person is. We've never met him. Nothing he's saying is true. And the idea that any sort of activist in the U.S. would be involved in high-level negotiations between Hamas, Qatar, the Israelis is frankly completely insane. You gotta admire the balls on someone who's willing to even attempt to frame that like they were involved. Like it's insane. This is the kind of stuff that heads of state are involved in, not some guy with 4 million Instagram followers who has never been to the Middle East before. It's insane. But yeah, I mean, I think it's one thing that I think everyone on every side can agree on is that this guy's just a fraudulent. It would be hilarious if it wasn't so depressing.
Awful. Yeah.
And he's trying to raise money on it too. He's like posting on Instagram for people to follow him now and pay a subscription so he can keep raising money off this. And it's just like people who glom onto this issue solely as a means of like generating clout or advancing their careers or making money don't care about the actual people on the ground. Like, do not care. And you can see much more measured statements from Palestinians and Israelis about what's happening and what's going on. It's one of these things where people in the West, and again, I'm saying this for all sides, are far more vitriolic and just downright shitty, and they don't do anyone any favors. They only make it more intractable. And that's the scary thing, is that that's what young people are being raised on, right? That's where none of these people read books on these subjects. None of them talk to anyone in the area. They're just going after the most anger-inducing, rage-baiting stuff. And that's where people are getting their news, on TikTok, on Instagram, on Twitter. There's no fact-checking. There's just no. It's scary where we're going to be at in 20 years when this generation is getting all their information from online propagandists.
Yeah. No, I mean, so we talked about this offline, like I guess before we started recording, but like that's why I started this podcast, right? And maybe it's a bit hubristic to think that I'll make any kind of a difference here, right? But like it's calling out nonsense, and specifically in an era where digital media can platform or offers a platform to basically anybody who wants it. Zealotry sells more than factuality, right?
Oh yeah,
and that's
why be rational and have common sense and actually want to improve things when you can scream and yell and that's, I mean, this isn't just this issue. This is podcasts, streamers, Twitch, all that. Like there are very few reasonable voices that don't actively contribute to making things worse.
Yeah. No, I mean, so the thing you said about reading books is, again, like, I'm a fucking nerd, so like maybe that's my bias for agreeing with you, but I think that's right? Like that's incredibly important. I think the thing to do here, right, is to offer people a reading list, right? And I've done this on Instagram. Again, I have like 2 followers, so who gives a shit, right? But like you had some recommendations for books, and I had some as well. Do you want to offer yours, and then I'll offer mine? But so also the thing I will say. Hang on one second. The thing I will say, okay, so if you're not somebody who likes to read books as well, I read shit for work. That's my job, right? So I listen to audiobooks. I'm not going to like shout out companies that do this, but like we all know them. A lot of these books that I think that Danny and I are about to mention are available on audiobooks. And right. And so like when you're not listening to the Underworld podcast, you can listen to some of these books on some of those platforms. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Simon Montefiore's it's a book called Jerusalem. I forget, Simon Sebag Montefiore, Sebag. It's a book called Jerusalem, and it's like it's the history of Jerusalem, basically going back thousands of years. But I think it's a really good. It's first of all, it's written like it's a movie. It's fantastic. I love the stuff that goes back a couple thousand years, but I think it's a really good primer on this issue. And I haven't kept up with my reading on this subject because I just found it such a, I don't know, hopeless, like heated debate that it wasn't something where I'm like, I'm going to dive into it because just reading about it depresses me. I actually recently read Amos Alon's Jerusalem, which I thought was great. I think it was written in the 80s or maybe even in the 90s. So a little before everything else. And then I actually just bought, I haven't read it in years. So I don't, maybe I read it 20 years ago. I don't even know. When was it first published? It might've been 15 years ago, but Benny Morris's 1948. No, it was less. It was 15 years ago, maybe. Which I think is supposed to be one of the best books about 1948. But yeah, there's I mean, authors have their biases too, and people should be aware of that. I think one of the things I always like to do when I read a book that's really convincing, that's nonfiction, is I'll Google criticism of it.
Right.
Because it's very easy to make your case. Like any documentary book, it's very easy to make your case and choose the stuff that you want to choose. And I think people do that. People do that with the news all the time. And yeah, so just be aware of that. I mean, I wish I could give concrete answers about who was right and who wasn't, but I can't. I don't know.
Yeah. From my perspective, I think like I read a lot about terrorism, the history of terrorism, just trying to understand, terrorism itself as a phenomenon, right? And that not limited, I guess, to the Israel-Palestine conflict, but also like more broadly. But I'll save those recommendations, the ones more broadly, for somewhere else. Here, and I talked about like perceptions of the Mossad, and whether by their own design or just by media coverage of things that they've done, there's this perception of Israel and of the Mossad of being this like omniscient, omnipotent, like indefatigable force, right? That just knows and everything and can do whatever it wants. And I read a book recently that you'll listen to rather that provided a balanced perspective on the Israeli intelligence services, the Mossad specifically, but also to a lesser extent, Shabak and Aman. And the book is called Rise and Kill First by a journalist called Ronan Bergman. But so that book was great. And I'll link all these books in the show notes here, both Dana's recommendations and myself. But yeah, I mean, I guess the main thing is if you're listening to this episode, you're clearly like interested in this topic area. From both of us, I think the advice is don't just listen to us or to Twitter or anything else, but read a book or 2 or 10. Jonathan Shanzer's Hamas versus Fatah is it's the subtitle of that is The Struggle for Palestine, and it gives you sort of an interesting perspective on like how we got to Hamas's rule of Gaza today, and really a history of the Palestinian struggle. So another one, and I guess finally on this topic is it's not directly about Gaza or Hamas, but it gives you a generous amount of context about regional politics. The book's called Beirut Rules, and it's by Samuel M. Katz and Fred Burton, and it centers on the murder of William Buckley, the CIA station chief in Lebanon. But it does much more than that, and it gives you, I would say, a very interesting historical perspective on terrorism and regional politics in specifically Lebanon, but in that area of the Middle East as well. Yeah, cool. So, and now I guess turning to a topic that I try to read and learn as much as I can about any given issue, but there's just some stuff that like I won't have time for, won't be able to access. And that's a big reason why having guests on a podcast like this and having them give the stuff that they're exposed to and that they look at more closely, the light, right? And so what I'm talking about here specifically is what reactions and perspectives are in Israel and in Israeli media, and generally about the latest run of events from the Netanyahu-led government, and context around that that we might not get watching American media.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to being an expert on that. I talk to family members that are there, cousins, things like that, and I read Israeli media here and there. A lot of, I think, people had this wrong impression that during a war like this, they'd rally around the government, but no.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the country itself is rallying and supporting itself, but they hate the government. This is the worst security failure I think the country's ever had, because at least in 73, they weren't as technologically efficient or advanced as they are right now. So people want blood. Like they just want the government, blood of the government. Like they want Netanyahu out. They want his party out. They feel abandoned. They feel like it's incompetent. It's a disaster. Even 4 or 5 months ago or 3 months ago, whatever it was, when these protests started, there were warnings. There were articles written about how he's dismantling the security apparatus through whatever he was appointing, friends or people that were kissing his ass that weren't qualified, he was paralyzing basically the country's ability to defend itself. And that came true. And Israelis do not forgive people who get their children murdered.
Yeah.
Like they will not. I mean, it's in the middle of a war right now, so I don't think you'll see him out. But like they are furious with the government. I don't think I've ever seen this much anger.
When digging into exactly how the attack unfolded, right? Because I mean, in America, we have this big quote unquote border crisis, right? It's actually kind of shocking how people tried to co-opt the Gaza story into supposedly Hamas and infiltrating Texas.
That's stupid.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's another ridiculous take that I'm just like, no, I want to like break my desk with my forehead when I hear shit like that. But look, the Gaza border security, I mean, as has been shown plain as day, is one, vital, right, for security, and two, not as secure as people thought, right? But when you like, I don't know if you saw like how there was a breakdown in the Washington Post about like how the attack unfolded, and they used drones to disable cameras and automated machine gun turrets, and then used a bulldozer to like ram the fence through. And it's like, I don't know, man, right? But like, if you war game this stuff out, right? And neither of us are soldiers, right? But like, or defense experts, but like, you would think that a government that prioritizes and like platforms itself on being like, yeah, we are the providers of the most security for Israel, right? Which I think was like a part of like Netanyahu's kind of platform. To have a failure exist, and mind you, I don't think they necessarily oversaw the like construction and setup of the Gaza border, defenses, but certainly they were under their control at this time, right? And it's like, how did an attack that was, when you look at it, it's kind of rudimentary, right? And kind of like using commercially available technology in an environment where like you can't even always get commercially available technology, right? Like Hamas doesn't have like the greatest of supply lines, and how they were able to do this. And then you look at like, I can only imagine, and this is just, my kind of umbrage as not being an Israeli, being like a passive onlooker. I can only imagine what people in Israel are looking at this stuff now and thinking like, what happened? How?
Yeah. I mean, they see it as a complete breakdown of military intelligence and the government. They're absolutely furious. Like this should never have been able to happen. They feel abandoned, I think, and left to themselves.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess to kind of like get towards the end of this is like, what do you think that, like, what do you want people to know, and what do you want people to think about, and what do you want people to question when they see coverage? Because this story is, I mean, I shouldn't even call it a story. This event about which there will be stories is not even close to over, right?
I just don't see anything on TikTok, on Instagram, on Twitter. Do not buy into it. Like, look stuff. I still trust, even though I think media completely screwed up, I still would rather trust the New York Times, or the Wall Street Journal or CNN than anything I would ever see on social media, because it's all just, I mean, that goes for pretty much every story. But I don't know. I mean, these are, when it comes down to it, it's not about people yelling at each other online or in the West. There's people that this actually affects.
Yeah.
And you might not know it. The person I knew who was posting that stuff, but people that you might know here have family both in Gaza and in Israel. So just be conscientious of that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's honestly it's funny because I hear you say that and I echo it, right? I think the biggest challenge is how do we get that through the heads of people whose heads that's not already through, right? Like, I think there's people who do take a view of, open source intelligence, or like, social media takes by people that might not have the appropriate gravitas to be making those takes or giving those takes, right? And there's people who already view that with skepticism, and then there's people who like buy it wholesale and retweet it, and sometimes perniciously, and sometimes or like with intent, and sometimes because they're the so-called useful idiot. Accessing those people and like kind of shaking them is sort of like the thing that I struggle with thinking about how one would even try to do, but two guys on a podcast, I don't think we're going to solve that problem.
Maybe if we had another hour.
Yeah. I mean, this conversation's been real. And look, man, this has been great. And I would hope to have you back on for other stuff as things go on. And if folks out there listening, if you haven't checked out Danny and his colleague Sean's podcast, The Underworld, one of the things I tell my wife and myself especially, right, is it's important to, like, even when there's a story that's so captivating, is to kind of unplug and watch and listen to other shit, just so like you don't get sucked in, right? Because being too sucked into anything is perilous for objectivity. And look, Danny didn't ask me to make this plug, but I found his podcast to be great because it is about stuff that is, one, not stuff you might necessarily be thinking about, right? Unless you think about organized crime in various corners of the world. But it's super interesting, and it encourages critical thinking, but also on a topic that is not, generally in the headlines right now, right? And so it's a good disconnect. I don't know.
Little more fun than Israel Palestine.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you guys have? Can you preview stuff you have coming up next, or is that still embargoed?
I mean, I'm doing some stuff that some Canada Vancouver gang war stuff. I would say that we've done Israeli mafia stories. We've done Arab organized crime in Israel proper. I think we did an episode on each one of those, so that's definitely out there somewhere. But yeah, I mean, that's generally what our topics are. Sean's got something on Chechnyan gangsters, I think a part 3 for something he's been working on coming up, stuff like that. I mean, we're playing catch up right now because I think all of us have been glued to the news and our phones, unfortunately, the past 2 weeks, but yeah, good stuff coming up. The Underworld podcast, anywhere you get podcasts.
Cool. Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
No, dude. Yeah. No, absolutely. It's been real. And yeah, guys, hopefully this has been fun and interesting, and we'll have more episodes like this on Noisecutter coming up pretty soon. All right, until next time. See you guys. The Noisecutter podcast is a production of Titan Gray, LLC, and is hosted by me, Rex Chatterjee. If you found our podcast helpful and want to say thanks, please head over to your favorite podcast app, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever else, and give us a review, leave a comment, and hit that follow or subscribe button to stay up to date on the latest. For more about our guest or to this episode, head over to our website, noisecutterpodcast.com, where you'll find contact info for our guest as well as links to some of the things we talked about on this episode. If you want to reach us directly, just send an email to info@noisecutterpodcast.com. This recording is a copyright of Titan Gray, LLC, with all rights reserved. This podcast may be construed as attorney advertising, and prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Nothing in this podcast should be construed as legal advice, and your listening to this podcast or contacting us about it does not form an attorney-client relationship. No affiliation or relationship, including an attorney-client relationship, exists between us and our guests unless otherwise stated. For full terms of use, please visit our website at noisecutterpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time here at Noisecutter.